You know, many Canadians are really concerned that vaccine passports may be on the way. That means you won't be able to access certain businesses or government institutions without one. To discuss this in more detail is Toronto Sun columnist and one of our regular contributors, Mr. Brian Lilley. Brian, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has already said no chance to the idea of vaccine passports, but not all premiers really agree.
No, they don't. And it is really a provincial issue. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked about this earlier in the week. He said that, he's working on a what amounts effectively to a vaccine passport for you and I if we're traveling outside of the country, because many countries will require proof of vaccination and that they want Canadians to be able to say, yes, I was vaccinated, let me into your country. And the federal government is also going to be checking travelers coming in. But as far as going to your local businesses, a restaurant, a store, going into your office, that is at the provincial level. Jason Kenney has said no for Alberta. Scott Moe said no for Saskatchewan, and Doug Ford here in Ontario has said no as well. BC still toying with the idea, and Quebec says they may go to that if there's a fourth wave in the fall as a way to keep businesses open. Because if you're not vaccinated and they get a fourth wave, then you may not be allowed to go to the gym or a cafe, let's say. That's kind of the direction that France has gone. France is even mandating that healthcare workers get vaccinated or face sanctions, perhaps even be fired by September 15th. But that isn't the way that we're going here, thankfully. Now, there are businesses and schools that are saying you won't be allowed on campus if you're not vaccinated. But all of those, in my view, and speaking with several lawyers on this, is those will end up with court challenges. If the government did it, pal, it would be a charter challenge. But when it's a private business, and that could include a college or university, when they're doing it, it tends to fall under things like privacy laws or healthcare acts, which both Alberta and Saskatchewan have healthcare acts that forbid you from being forced to present your own personal medical information, which is essentially what this is. So it's going to be an interesting time over the next little while as we sort this out. But so far, premiers of the big provinces are mostly saying no.
A missionary couple in their 80s, Brian, was handed a substantial fine for arriving in Canada and not booking at a quarantine hotel. Now, what can you tell us about Glenn and Thelma Perry?
Well, Glenn is 87 years old. Thelma is 80 years old. And they live just north of Toronto in a place called Barrie, Ontario. They do missionary work in Jamaica. They go down and they're helping people who are not well off. They're looking after the least fortunate among us. And they came back 2 hours and 6 minutes before the rules changed on July the 5th. It's remarkable that this couple, who I'm told their combined income for the year is about $12,000 a year. The church pays for them for their flights to go down to Jamaica and do this work. They make about $12,000 a year. The fine was $6,000.
Wow.
More than $6,000. Each of them had a ticket in excess of $3,000 because they didn't book the COVID hotel. They could have just, if you wanted to be a stickler, you could have just kept them at the airport and said, you're not leaving this area until 12:01 when the new rules kick in. So their local MP, a conservative named John Brassard, he's gotten involved. He's asked the health minister, Patty Hajdu, and the public safety minister, Bill Blair, to show some compassion, show some common sense, and just waive these tickets. And hopefully that's the final outcome of this.
Yeah, let's pray for the best for both Glenn and Thelma Perry. Brian, it appears as though the Canada-U.S. border will remain somewhat closed until July 21st. Now, the United States wants it open, but what are the Trudeau Liberals saying?
Well, they're talking about it eventually opening, but it's hard to get a clear read. And here we are just a week away from this potential reopening. A lot of people thought when the last extension went in that this would be the last. There are moves, as you know, Hal, I know you're a big sports fan. There are moves to get the Toronto Blue Jays playing back in Toronto by the end of July, July 30th. There are moves to have, Toronto FC and the Vancouver Whitecaps allowed to be able to play at home. That would require at least some reopening of the border. As far as regular citizens go, it's really unclear. The Americans want it open. Chuck Schumer, leading Democrat from New York, has called for it to be open. There have been demonstrations, rallies, press conferences in the U.S. saying we need the border open. We want to get back to normal. But I'll tell you this, based on what the PM said, even if we do open it up, it won't be back to normal the way it was before.
The tourism sector has really taken a massive hit during the pandemic, Brian, and the Prime Minister says he will not be allowing unvaccinated visitors into Canada anytime soon. And that's not good news for our relatives who want to visit us from Europe or maybe South America.
It's there's several things here, and this is what I mean when I say that even if he opens the border, it won't get back to the way it was before. Unvaccinated people will not be allowed in for some time, is what the Prime Minister said. We also have concerns, though, of okay, if someone did get vaccinated, did they get the right vaccines? Right now, you're only allowed to skip the hotel quarantine if you're a Canadian citizen or permanent resident who flies back into the country and you've had one of the 4 approved by Canada vaccines. If you had a different one in Europe, in the Middle East, in Russia, in China, if you had those at this point, you're not allowed in. So the government is trying to work through those. It's going to take quite a bit of time before we start getting back to what we were seeing before. A lot of tourists from the United States who will want to come up won't be vaccinated at all, and we won't be letting them into this country for the foreseeable future.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been in campaign mode, Brian, making stops in Calgary with that big recent transit announcement, and in BC promising $10 a day childcare. He also signed a similar deal with Nova Scotia. Now, you say the numbers of this Quebec-style national daycare program really don't add up. Can you explain?
Well, the idea behind the Quebec program is that it's universal. It costs $10 a day. And as every Albertan can tell you, Quebec can only do that because of equalization payments, $15 billion a year, much of which has come from Alberta over the past decade or so. The numbers that the Prime Minister was talking about in BC, I took a hard look at them, did up a column on the topic, and they don't add up. In British Columbia, it was a promise of $3.2 billion over 5 years. When you work it out by the number of children under the age of 6, because that's what this is for, kids 5 and under, it works out, Hal, to $8.95 a day, for the work week. The cost of childcare in Richmond, British Columbia goes as high as $59 a day. So the government's promising $10 a day daycare. It currently costs $59. That means there's another $51.05 that has to be made up somewhere else. Now, I know that not every kid goes into daycare, but if you're going to call it a universal program, if you're going to call it this $10 a day system, then you better deliver. And right now, they're not.
The election speculation is not stopping, Brian, with all of the recent funding announcements, but Nova Scotia Premier Rankin could actually derail Trudeau's plan for a federal election. Can you explain why?
Well, generally speaking, parties of the federal government doesn't like going into an election when when there's a provincial one, especially not if it's one that the governing party is friendly to. Elections Nova Scotia held a tech briefing this week for journalists on how the vote will take place. So they are going full steam ahead towards an election. It could change the Prime Minister's plans, which we're told at this point would involve about a month from now dropping the writ. The new Governor General gets installed on July 26th. We have the August long weekend, and then shortly after that, we head into a campaign with voting day in early to mid-September. So if Nova Scotia, where the Liberals do have a number of seats and where they want to continue to hold those seats, if they're both campaigning at the same time, it makes it more difficult. You tend to use the same volunteers. People who are politically active are often active at both the provincial and the federal level. So they're going to lose a lot of volunteers. They're going to be confusing voters there.
Right.
So we'll have to wait and see. The Prime Minister was asked about it. He played coy. Premier Rankin played coy. But this could become a determining factor. All I can tell you, Hal, is there is the possibility of an increase in cases. I don't think it'll be a fourth wave with a lot of people going to hospital and dying like we saw in the past. But the Prime Minister still wants this election out of the way before COVID numbers start rising again in the fall.
Brian, the federal Liberals recently shot down an attempt to probe the use of taxpayer money to pay for a key campaign worker. What was the issue here?
The issue is a guy named Tom Pitfield, who's been friends with Justin Trudeau since they were children. Tom Pitfield's father was the clerk of the Privy Council to Pierre Trudeau. So Tom and Justin grew up together. Tom Pitfield was in Justin Trudeau's wedding party and works on campaigns. His wife is the former president of the Liberal Party of Canada, and they all went on that infamous vacation to the Aga Khan's billionaire island, the illegal vacation, by the way. So Tom Pitfield also owns a company called Data Sciences that has been used as a vendor by the Liberals in the last several elections. They, as the name would suggest, are involved in using data to target voters. They collect all the information they can on you. They customize messages towards you. Tom Pitfield runs this company. Turns out that it has been, they've been getting money out of what's called the member's office budget. So individual MPs signing up in a coordinated fashion to pay for this company to do constituency work. So they're doing the voter work, and in between elections, they get government money to keep them going. The Conservatives and the NDP and the Bloc all said, this looks a little funny, we want to look into it. The Liberals talked and talked and talked. It was supposed to be a 2-hour committee meeting to set up an investigation. Instead, the Liberals talked out the clock. When one member had to leave the room, a New Democrat had to leave the room to take a phone call, they immediately moved to say, we want to adjourn the meeting. You can't raise a point of order or stop an adjournment vote. So it was shot down very quickly in an underhanded way. When they're trying that hard not to have things looked at, makes me think that maybe we really should be looking into it.
The protests continue in Cuba as locals are angry and are calling for an end to restrictions. The word freedom could be heard echoing through the streets of both Havana and Veradero. Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole issued a clear statement standing with the Cuban people against the Castro dictatorship. But Trudeau, when asked, didn't really condemn the crackdown by the Cuban government. Could this have something to do with the history between the Trudeaus and the Castros?
My guess is yes, and the fact that he does have a tendency to like dictators. His brother once described Fidel Castro as superhuman, referred to him as Uncle Fidel, I believe, in an op-ed that ran in Canada's largest newspaper. Fidel Castro spoke at Pierre Trudeau's funeral. Now, Fidel Castro obviously passed on, but his family remains in control. Cuba has been run under a dictatorship for decades now, and that alone should be enough to have them condemned, but Justin Trudeau simply couldn't do it. He's being called out by media outlets for it, and I have to say, they're right on this. You can't admire someone's basic dictatorship as they're suppressing the basic human rights of their own people, and that's what's happening in Cuba right now. People are it's a combination of a lack of medicine and food, frustration over COVID measure restrictions, all of this taking to the point where Cubans were actually demonstrating in the streets, unheard of, chanting freedom. And when the police and military went in to shut it down, Trudeau was not there to say, not there to condemn it. He was rather weak in his words on this front.
Now, Brian, before I let you go, I want to try and get an update from you in regards to Bill C-6, which is potentially modifying the criminal code to include conversion therapy. What's the latest?
There's no moves. I mean, there was some discussion about having it looked at over the summer by senators. That hasn't happened yet. Whether they will try and hold some meetings over the summer months and try and pass it remains to be seen. If not, it'll come back in the fall. That is, of course, unless we go to an election, at which point the bill will be dead in the water. As we've discussed before, a lot of people thinking that the language in the bill is too vague can lead to a lot of people facing criminal charges over things that should never end up before the courts.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.